The sun rose slowly over the low, misty swamplands of South Carolina, painting the cypress trees and the sluggish waters in muted gold and green. On the edge of the Marshbend plantation, a young woman named Sarah Drummond stirred beneath a threadbare blanket, her eyes opening to the distant clatter of work in the fields. The cries of children mingled with the calls of overseers, and for a moment, the world felt as it always had, hard, relentless, and unforgiving. Sarah rose quietly, her long limbs stretching with a stiffness born of both fatigue and the bruises that still ached from the previous day's punishment. Sarah was not like the other enslaved women on Marshbend. Even at 18, she towered over most of the men in the fields, her broad shoulders and long arms hinting at a strength that belied her years. Her hands were calloused from endless labor, yet precise and careful in the tasks she performed, spinning, sewing, tending to the small garden that fed her cabin, and later carrying water from the well miles away. Her skin bore marks, some faint, some deep, evidence of the discipline and cruelty that had been visited upon her from childhood. Yet her eyes, dark and unwavering, held a fire that no whip, no insult, no indignity could extinguish. The plantation was alive before dawn. Men dragged plows through muddy rice fields, their shouts carrying across the waterlogged land. Children, some barely old enough to walk, followed their mothers clutching at the hem of skirts or tiny bundles of food for the workday. The air smelled of wet earth and the pungent tang of manure, mixed with smoke from early fires set to cook breakfast. From the edge of the fields, overseers' voices rang sharp and commanding, a constant reminder that the day belonged not to the enslaved but to the master. Sarah dressed quickly in a simple dress, patched in places but clean, and wrapped her hair with a worn cloth. She stepped outside, her feet sinking slightly into the soft, wet earth. Across the plantation, cabins were beginning to stir. Some women sang low, quiet songs as they prepared children for the day. Others walked in silence, their faces set in lines of determination. There was no warmth in the air this morning, no promise of relief, only the rhythm of labor, the endless repetition that defined their lives. Her son Jacob was still asleep in a small cradle beside the fire. He had been born during a time of relative calm on Marshbend, but those days were fleeting. Sarah approached him and lifted him gently, wrapping him in a blanket she had stitched herself. She felt his tiny heart beating, warm and unsteady. He was all she had left, and the thought of him being taken, sold like a bundle of rice or a crate of chickens, never left her mind. The morning passed in a blur of work. Sarah carried baskets of harvested rice to the drying platforms, moved sacks of corn, and bent over the fields under the watchful eyes of the overseers. Each strike of her back against the sun-soaked earth, each load she carried, seemed to weigh not only on her body, but on her soul. Yet she did not complain, did not falter. Her strength, her size and her quiet endurance earned both fear and grudging respect from those around her. It was in the late afternoon, as the sun began to dip low behind the distant tree line, that the incident that would change everything began. Josiah Crane, the plantation owner, was not a man to be reasoned with. He had a temper that flared quickly, often violently, and a particular distaste for any perceived insolence from his enslaved workers. That day he had been inspecting the fields and cabins, his eyes sharp for any sign of laziness, disobedience, or defiance. When he reached Sarah's cabin, he noticed Jacob in her arms. "This child is not yours to keep," Crane said, his voice low but dangerous. "I have decided to sell him. He will bring $400. Come morning, he will be gone." Sarah's hands tightened around the blanket, her body stiffened, her mind flashing with disbelief and rage. "No," she whispered, though the words seemed pitiful against the authority of the man before her. "You cannot do this. He is my son," Crane sneered, a cruel smile stretching across his face. "I can, and I will. You are my property, and so is everything you carry or create. Your grief does not change the law." By nightfall the decision had been enforced. Jacob was taken from Sarah's arms, wrapped in a coarse blanket, and loaded onto a wagon bound for the main road. The cries of her son pierced the humid air, echoing against the distant swamps. Sarah watched, her face an unreadable mask, as the wagon rolled away under Crane's supervision. Around her the other enslaved people went about their routines. Though the tension was palpable, everyone understood the stakes, the unspoken knowledge that something terrible had just occurred. Sarah returned to work with a deliberate precision, moving as if performing a ritual, each motion steady and controlled. She refused the food offered, spoke to no one, and bore herself with a strange, quiet intensity that unnerved those around her. Hours passed, the sun setting in deep, molten oranges and purples. Finally, she stopped working and moved toward the cabin where Marcus, another enslaved man, lay recovering from a severe beating. She entered without knocking, her presence filling the room like a storm gathering strength. Marcus, pale and in pain, looked up at her, and for nearly an hour, they spoke in whispers no one else could hear. The conversation was described later as final, as if they were saying goodbye. At one point, Marcus reached out and took her hand, and for a long moment, they simply sat in silence. When Sarah finally left, Marcus's voice, barely audible, carried through the cabin. "You do what you have to do." Night descended fully, and Sarah did not eat the evening meal. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, staring at the empty cradle. Around 9 o'clock she stood, extinguished the single candle that illuminated the cabin, and left. Those who saw her described a figure moving with a strange, almost inhuman grace across the plantation grounds, a towering silhouette swallowed by darkness. She made her way to the main house, entering through the kitchen door. The house was mostly empty. Crane was in his library, working by lamplight on account books, now including the $400 from Jacob's sale. Ruth and Isaac, the servants who remained, were occupied elsewhere, unaware of her approach. The next moments, as reconstructed later, were charged with tension and dread. Ruth, who had heard the commotion, described Crane's voice, raised in anger, demanding that Sarah leave. Her response was calm, deliberate. A gun was drawn, a shot fired into her shoulder, yet she did not falter. The wound bled freely, but her determination remained unbroken. Step by step she closed the distance between herself and Crane. The pistol slipped from his trembling hands. "What do you want?" Crane stammered. "My son," Sarah replied, her voice steady, unwavering. The encounter ended with horrifying finality. Crane's skull was crushed by hands of extraordinary strength. The physical evidence was undeniable. Sarah Drummond, a woman who had been beaten, humiliated, and treated as property, had exacted revenge in the most brutal way imaginable. And then, as suddenly as she had arrived, she disappeared. The window behind the desk was open. A trail of blood led out into the darkness, into the vast, treacherous swamps that surrounded Marshbend. By the time overseers and other men arrived, she was gone. In the days that followed, a search of unprecedented scope failed to find her. Patrols scoured the rice fields, the swamps and the forests, dogs tracking the trail until it vanished at the edge of the wetland. Weeks passed. Nothing. The plantation was left in uneasy silence, the enslaved workers terrified, the overseers shaken. Sarah Drummond's disappearance quickly became legend. Stories began to circulate of a giant woman, taller and stronger than any ordinary person, moving unseen through the swamps and forests. Some said she was alive, surviving by her own cunning and strength. Others claimed she had perished, her body consumed by the alligators and wild pigs of the wetlands. Rumors persisted for decades. Escaped enslaved people traveling north spoke of a woman helping them along the Underground Railroad, asking only about her son, moving silently and without fear. Plantation owners in South Carolina and Georgia reported thefts and strange sightings, always attributing them to a woman of unusual size. In private diaries and letters, the story was retold again and again, growing in detail and in legend, yet always anchored in the fact of the night at Marshbend, and still, the truth remained elusive. Had Sarah survived the swamps, evaded capture, and continued her search for Jake, or had she succumbed to her wounds in the isolation of the wetlands, leaving behind only whispers and fear? The historical record could not provide certainty. What it did document, however, was clear. Sarah Drummond existed. She lived. She suffered. She resisted. And on the night of August 14, 1827, she claimed justice in the only way left to her, vanishing into history as completely as she had arrived. The swamps and forests around Marshbend swallowed Sarah Drummond that night as easily as they had swallowed countless others before her. For those left behind, the aftermath was a mixture of fear, confusion, and awe. Overseers and plantation owners whispered about her size, her strength, her audacity. Some feared her as a monstrous avenger. Others trembled at the thought of her as a spirit that could haunt the marshes for years to come. Authorities arrived in Charleston 2 days later. Magistrate William Huger led a small party that included the sheriff, 2 deputies and a physician named James Pellow. When they finally reached Marshbend, the plantation was tense and silent. The enslaved community, usually lively despite oppression, was subdued. Even the most hardened field hands avoided looking directly at the overseer. The house was cordoned off, and the library, the scene of Josiah Crane's death, was treated as a crime scene. Dr. Pello's examination of Crane's body confirmed the horrific nature of the act. The skull had been crushed with such force that it could not have been accomplished by an ordinary man. The indentation patterns on the bones suggested enormous hands, unusually long and wide, gripping and squeezing, until the cranium collapsed inward. The coroner's report, preserved in the Charleston archives, noted that the injuries could not be replicated by any known weapon or tool. Only an individual of extraordinary strength, a giant among humans, could have committed such violence with bare hands. The authorities began questioning everyone on the plantation. Ruth, who had witnessed the events from the stairs, described Sarah's calm and deliberate movement. Isaac corroborated the trail of blood leading from the house to the swamp. Other enslaved people, initially fearful of speaking out, detailed the years of abuse Sarah had endured, her remarkable size and her unparalleled strength. Marcus, still recovering from his severe beating, maintained that he had been confined to his cabin and knew nothing of Sarah's actions until after the incident. The law was complicated. Could an enslaved woman claim self-defense against her owner? The statutes of South Carolina said no. Yet the circumstances, the theft of her child, the brutal oppression she had suffered for years, the gunshot wound she had sustained, made even the magistrates uneasy. Many whispered privately that Sarah's act was more than vengeance. It was justice, raw and unmediated. As the search for Sarah extended into the swamps and forests, rumors began to take shape. She had vanished from sight, leaving behind only a trail of blood that disappeared at the edge of the marsh. Weeks of searching yielded nothing. Dog tracks ended in waterlogged soil. Droppings, broken branches, and faint footprints led nowhere. The swamps were an ideal hiding place, treacherous for any pursuer but familiar to someone who had lived and worked the land for years. Then came reports from far beyond South Carolina. In 1831, escaped enslaved people traveling north on the Underground Railroad reported being aided by a woman of extraordinary height. She moved silently through the forest, knew every hidden path, and asked only about a boy, Jacob, the name of her son. In 1835, an overseer in northern Georgia claimed to have been lifted off the ground and thrown aside by a towering woman when he attempted to detain her. The woman vanished before he could gather help. By 1842, Quaker abolitionists in Ohio documented visits from a mysterious woman seeking the location of her child, bearing scars of violence and moving with a quiet, imposing authority. Stories multiplied over the years, often contradictory, sometimes fantastic. Among enslaved communities, Sarah Drummond became a symbol of resistance. Songs and stories circulated, often coded to avoid detection, portraying her as a spirit of vengeance who protected runaways and punished cruel masters. In contrast, white Southerners painted her as a monstrous figure, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing enslaved people too far. Some claimed she had become a cannibal. Others said she had gone mad and roamed the swamps attacking any white person she encountered. Yet there were quieter, more hopeful accounts. Free black communities and abolitionists told of a woman who had survived, escaped north, and perhaps reunited with her son. Some claimed she had become a conductor on the Underground Railroad, guiding enslaved people to freedom, using her knowledge of the southern wilderness. These stories, though difficult to verify, were recorded in private diaries, letters, and oral histories, preserved for future generations. One particularly intriguing account came decades later. In 1889, Dr. Robert Hayes, a physician in Philadelphia, was attending to a dying elderly black woman. On her deathbed, she claimed that her mother had been an escaped slave from South Carolina, a woman of extraordinary size who had killed her owner in the 80s. She had survived the wilderness, eventually finding her way north with help from free black communities and Quaker abolition. She had spent years searching for her first child, Jacob, never finding him, and had settled in Pennsylvania under a new identity. Dr. Hayes recorded the conversation in a letter to a colleague, noting the story's remarkable nature, but acknowledging that it could not be verified. The woman died 2 days later, and the trail ended. Was she Sarah herself, or was this simply another layer of legend built on hope and longing? No one could say for certain. The official search for Sarah gradually faded. Slave catchers, patrols, and rewards posted across the South yielded no results. The consensus among authorities was grim. Sarah had likely succumbed to her gunshot wound and disappeared into the swamps, her body claimed by nature. The swamps, the forests, and the rivers of South Carolina and Georgia became part of her legend. Over time, she was described as a spirit of vengeance, a protector, a ghostly guide, or even a symbol of justice in an unjust world. Plantation owners whispered of thefts and impossible feats of strength. Enslaved communities sang coded songs, telling of a woman who had struck back when all hope seemed lost. Free black communities spoke of her survival, her courage, and her relentless pursuit of her son. By the mid-19th century, Sarah Drummond had become more than a person. She was a story, a symbol, a warning, and an inspiration. Yet the historical record retained only fragments of truth. Official reports, coroner's documents, letters, and testimonies proved her existence and documented the death of Josiah Crane. Beyond that, everything becomes uncertain. The letters from distant towns, the stories of the Underground Railroad, the whispers of the swamps and forests, all suggest the presence of a remarkable woman whose determination defied death itself. Somewhere in the archives, in personal diaries and local records, hints of her life linger. A plantation owner in South Carolina, writing in his diary in 1838, described a towering figure moving silently through the trees, vanishing like a shadow when approached. Letters from abolitionists recount mysterious aid to runaway enslaved people. Anecdotes from Pennsylvania speak of an elderly woman who carried the weight of her past but lived free in her final years. None of these accounts can be verified with certainty, but together they form a mosaic of possibility, a life that transcended the confines of cruelty and oppression, a legend born from the very human need to hope. By the end of the 19th century, Sarah Drummond had passed from memory into legend. To some, she was a cautionary tale, a terrifying reminder of what could happen when a person is pushed beyond endurance. To others, she was a symbol of resistance, of maternal love, of courage in the face of impossible odds. Her story persisted in song, in oral history, and in the margins of historical records, a reminder that the human spirit can defy oppression even when the odds seem insurmountable. The enduring mystery of Sarah Drummond continues to captivate historians, writers, and storytellers. Did she survive the swamps and forests of South Carolina? Did she find her son, or at least ensure his survival? Did she live long enough to see the abolition of slavery and the promise of freedom she had fought for in her own way? Or did she perish quietly, leaving behind only her legend and the indelible mark of her actions on those who witnessed them? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between legend and fact. The evidence suggests that her extraordinary strength, her courage, and her determination were real. The specifics of her final fate may never be known. Yet in the decades following the night at Marshbend, every reported sighting, every whispered tale, every song sung in secret quarters reinforces one undeniable fact. Sarah Drummond existed, and she changed the lives of those around her in ways that can never be erased. Her story is not just about revenge or violence. It is about endurance, resistance, and the refusal to be silenced. It is about a mother's love and the lengths to which a person will go to reclaim what has been stolen. And it is about the human need to believe in justice, even when the law denies it. Whether she lived to old age in Pennsylvania, or perished in the swamps, Sarah Drummond became more than a woman. She became a symbol, a legend, and a testament to the power of courage in the face of unimaginable oppression. Even decades after her disappearance, Sarah Drummond's name continued to resonate across the South. Stories circulated in whispers, half remembered, half imagined, but all carrying a sense of awe. Plantation owners spoke of her with a mixture of fear and disbelief, while enslaved people passed along songs and tales about a giant woman who defied her oppressors. These stories became a kind of oral record, blending fact and legend, teaching lessons about courage, resistance, and survival. In the early 1830s, reports surfaced in towns along the Savannah River. Merchants, farmers, and travelers occasionally claimed to have glimpsed a woman of extraordinary stature moving silently through the forests or along rivers. Some said she was asking about newly sold children, or observing plantation routines, disappearing before anyone could intervene. These sightings were never confirmed, and official reports dismissed them as exaggerations or alcohol-fueled imagination. Yet the pattern was consistent. The woman was always described as tall, imposing, silent, and determined, with a presence that unsettled even the most seasoned adults. By the mid-1830s, the legend had reached Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Escaped enslaved people traveling northward sometimes reported aid from a giant woman, though she never revealed her identity. Some claimed she guided them through the wilderness, warning of patrols and hidden dangers, moving with an almost supernatural knowledge of the terrain. Others described fleeting encounters where she disappeared before their eyes, leaving only footprints or broken branches as evidence. One of the most detailed accounts comes from a Quaker woman running a safe house on the Underground Railroad in Ohio, wrote in her diary about a visit. The woman was of extraordinary size, bearing scars from past violence, and asked persistently about a boy sold from Charleston years earlier. She stayed only one night, accepting food and shelter but refusing to reveal her name. In the morning she had vanished, leaving only the faint impression of her presence. The diary entry, preserved in local archives, sparked debate among historians. Was this truly Sarah Drummond, surviving for more than a decade beyond her escape, or merely a symbolic embodiment of resistance, her story given life through rumor and hope? Meanwhile, life at Marshbend and surrounding plantations continued, haunted by her memory. Overseers became hyper-vigilant, implementing stricter controls, increasing patrols, and questioning every unusual sound or movement in the field. Plantation owners spoke privately about the giant woman, though always with a mixture of disbelief and terror. Rumors of her survival made some wealthy landowners uneasy for years, worried that she might return to exact further vengeance. Among the enslaved, Sarah's legend became more than a story of fear. It became a symbol of empowerment. Songs were sung in secret, sometimes in code, about a woman who had struck back at her oppressor and disappeared, teaching lessons about courage, resistance, and hope. Mothers whispered her story to their children, warning them of the dangers in the world but also assuring them that strength, intelligence, and determination could turn the tide. Her narrative offered proof that no system of oppression, however brutal, was invincible. By the 1850s, the story of Sarah Drummond had evolved beyond personal legend into cultural myth. White Southerners exaggerated her size and strength, transforming her into a cautionary tale. Stories circulated of her lifting men off the ground, vanishing into forests, and appearing as a shadowy figure in plantation yards. Some even claimed that she had become a creature of the swamps, a ghostly presence who punished cruelty wherever it appeared. These tales, though often fantastical, reflected the underlying anxieties of a society built on slavery and fear. Meanwhile, abolitionist communities in the North and free black communities told a different story. Sarah was remembered not as a monster, but as a hero, a mother whose actions defied injustice, and whose courage inspired freedom. Letters, diaries, and personal accounts spoke of a woman moving north, helping escapees, and striving tirelessly to locate her son. In these accounts, she was no longer just a person. She had become a symbol of resistance, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit. The persistence of Sarah Drummond's story is remarkable, given the scarcity of physical evidence. Only a few documents, the coroner's report of Josiah Crane's death, eyewitness testimonies, sale records of Jacob, and the occasional letter or diary entry provide tangible proof. Yet the oral histories, repeated sightings, and Underground Railroad accounts suggest a continued presence, one that transcended her physical disappearance. One of the more intriguing leads came decades later. Robert Hayes of Philadelphia treated an elderly black woman who claimed her mother had been Sarah Drummond. The woman said her mother had survived in the wilderness for years before finding safe passage north, spent over a decade searching for her son, and eventually settled in Pennsylvania under a new name. Hayes recorded the conversation in a letter to a colleague, acknowledging that he could not verify the story. The woman died 2 days later, leaving only her account behind. Could this truly have been Sarah Drummond, living out her final years in anonymity? Or was it merely a passing of the legend from one generation to the next, taking tangible form in memory and imagination? Even today, the story resonates. Sarah Drummond embodies the tensions of her time, the brutality of slavery, the power of maternal love, and the human capacity for resistance. Her act at Marshbend, a single night in August 1827, changed countless lives. It provoked fear in the oppressors, inspired the oppressed, and generated a legend that would echo across generations. The psychological impact was profound. Plantation owners who survived her wrath implemented stricter systems of control, while enslaved communities preserved her story as a beacon of hope and courage. Jacob's life provides another layer to the narrative. Sold to the Havford family in Savannah, he grew up under their supervision, but carried the memory of his mother's extraordinary courage. He preserved artifacts, like the small wooden horse carved by his father Marcus, symbolizing the connections severed by slavery, but not entirely broken. Jacob eventually lived to see emancipation, raising a family and passing down stories of Sarah's heroism and tragedy. His daughter, named Sarah in her mother's honor, ensured that the memory of Drummond persisted through generations, bridging the gap between history and legend. The ambiguity of Sarah's ultimate fate is perhaps what fuels her enduring legend. Rational evidence suggests that her gunshot wound, combined with the hostile wilderness and active pursuit by men with weapons and dogs, would have likely led to her death within days of fleeing Marshbend. The letter sent to Charleston from Columbia, the reported sightings on the Underground Railroad, and the 1889 account from Dr. Hayes's patient all challenged this narrative, introducing doubt and hope in equal measure. Whether she survived or died, the figure of Sarah Drummond persisted as a cultural symbol, embodying resistance, maternal devotion, and the indomitable human spirit. Over time, her story became part of broader folklore. Scholars examining Southern ghost stories, legends of escaped slaves, and tales of resistance often cite Sarah Drummond as a foundational figure. Her life and actions serve as a case study of how personal tragedy intersects with historical oppression to create myth. She is remembered not only for the extraordinary act of violence against Josiah Crane, but for the complex layers of survival, justice, and legacy she left behind. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Sarah's tale had been recounted in local histories, newspapers, and oral narrative. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: her incredible strength, her maternal devotion, her cunning in evading capture, and the terror she inspired among slave owners. The legend, while sometimes exaggerated, captured a core truth about the human spirit. Extreme oppression often breeds extraordinary resistance. In modern historical analysis, Sarah Drummond is recognized as both a historical figure and a cultural. She serves as a lens through which historians examine the cruelty of the slave system, the limits of legal protection for enslaved people, and the ways in which stories of resistance circulate across communities. Her legend also reveals the ways memory and myth intertwine. Even when factual details are scarce, the moral and emotional truths of a person's actions can resonate across centuries. Today, some historians argue that Sarah Drummond should be remembered not merely as a figure of folklore, but as a woman whose real-life actions had measurable consequences. The murder of Josiah Crane destabilized the plantation hierarchy, altered the lives of those around her, and set in motion a series of events that would echo through the lives of freed and enslaved people alike. Her courage, intelligence, and strength serve as evidence that even in conditions designed to suppress humanity, individuals can assert power in transformative ways. The story of Sarah Drummond ultimately challenges conventional notions of history. While documents, records, and coroner's reports establish certain facts: the sale of Jacob, the death of Josiah Crane, the physical evidence of Sarah's extraordinary strength, much remains uncertain. The swamps and forests, the passage of time, and the secrecy required by her flight have all obscured her final fate. Yet the persistence of her legend, through oral history, letters, diaries, and folklore, ensures that her story remains alive. In the end, Sarah Drummond represents a complex intersection of history, myth, and morality. She was a mother, a survivor, a fugitive, a warrior, and a symbol. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about oppression, justice, and resistance. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by events and records, but also by the stories people tell, the memories they preserve, and the legends they create to make sense of suffering and courage. Whether she perished in the South Carolina swamps or lived to old age in Pennsylvania, Sarah Drummond's legacy persists. Her tale illustrates the limits of human endurance, the ferocity of maternal love, and the transformative power of resistance. For generations, she has inspired fear, hope, and admiration. She has been a cautionary tale, a hero, and a ghostly figure, whose presence can still be felt in the landscapes of the South and in the collective memory of those who value courage and justice. Her son, Jacob, lived a long life, passing down fragments of memory and artifacts that kept a connection to his mother alive. He named his daughter after Sarah, a quiet tribute that ensured the story persisted within family lines. Beyond the family, Sarah's story endured in the songs, legends, and personal accounts of enslaved and free Black communities, reminding all who heard it that even in the darkest circumstances, extraordinary individuals could resist, survive, and leave a legacy that defies time itself. The final truth about Sarah Drummond may never be known, yet the documented facts, her existence, the sale of her child, her violent act of vengeance, and her disappearance, are undeniable. Beyond that, the legend flourishes, reflecting the human need to hope, to resist, and to believe in the possibility of justice. Sarah Drummond, giant and mother, fugitive and legend, remains a figure who challenges our understanding of history, morality, and the extraordinary potential of the human spirit. Even as the 19th century wore on, the legend of Sarah Drummond retained a foothold in Southern memory. Stories circulated quietly, passed from one generation to the next, preserved in family lore and regional histories. These tales were often inconsistent, sometimes contradictory, but all carried the central truth: a woman had defied the expectations of a brutal system and escaped. Among enslaved communities, Sarah's story became an emblem of possibility. Even in captivity, her defiance proved that courage and determination could, if only briefly, level the playing field against tyranny. In 1857, a traveler passing through the swamps near the South Carolina-Georgia border, recorded in his journal a brief encounter with an unusually tall woman moving silently along the tree line. He described her as striking, with a bearing that was at once solemn and intimidating. She asked questions about children sold from Charleston several decades prior, and vanished before anyone could respond. The account was published locally, but scholars have debated its authenticity, yet it aligns closely with other sightings reported in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and northern Georgia. The consistency of her portrayal, enormous stature, unusual strength, and resolute determination lent the story a credibility that few purely folkloric tales enjoy. For free black communities in the North, the legend took on a different texture. In Philadelphia, Boston, and other cities along the Underground Railroad, whispers of Sarah Drummond as a guiding figure circulated among escapees and safehouse operators. These accounts emphasized her intelligence, her knowledge of terrain, and her unwavering focus on rescuing those in danger. While direct evidence is scarce, the persistence of the story in personal diaries, letters, and recollections suggests that at least some elements were drawn from reality. In this telling, Sarah Drummond was no longer merely a figure of vengeance. She became a conduit for freedom, a mother guiding others even in her absence from her own son's life. The 1860s brought additional layers to the narrative. The Civil War and emancipation reshaped the South, and stories of Sarah Drummond were sometimes evoked to illustrate both the cruelty of the past and the possibility of resistance. In slave quarters, her story remained a symbol of defiance. In white communities, it became cautionary, a reminder of the consequences when the human spirit could no longer be contained. Even as memories faded, her legend inspired songs, folk tales, and whispered accounts that circulated quietly but persistently. By the late 19th century, historians and journalists began to take a more systematic interest in documenting these legends. Researchers scoured archival material, collecting letters, diaries, and newspaper clippings. Among these discoveries was the 1889 account recorded by Robert Hayes in Philadelphia, describing the elderly woman who claimed her mother had been Sarah Drummond. Though unverifiable, the story suggested that the giant woman may have survived long enough to see the dismantling of slavery, to navigate the North in safety, and perhaps to continue her search for Jacob. Whether entirely true or partially symbolic, this account reaffirmed the impact Sarah had on multiple communities across decades. While much of the public imagination fixated on her physical prowess, the ability to lift grown men, the sheer strength to crush a skull, scholars increasingly recognized the strategic and psychological dimensions of her action. Killing Josiah Crane was not merely an act of brute force. It was deliberate, calculated, and precise. Her knowledge of the house, the timing of Crane's routines, and the decisive actions she took reflected intelligence, courage, and mastery over a situation stacked overwhelmingly against her. These qualities, rather than her size alone, contributed to the legend's enduring power. Sarah Drummond also became a subject of local lore and ghost stories in South Carolina. Plantation owners, freedmen, and travelers alike recounted fleeting glimpses of a towering figure moving along the edges of swamps and forests. In some tales, she appeared as a spectral presence, silently observing, punishing cruelty, or guiding runaway enslaved people to freedom. Over time, these ghostly accounts blurred the line between reality and folklore, yet they consistently preserved a central truth. The memory of Sarah Drummond remained potent, resonant, and haunting. Her story reached the written historical record sporadically but powerfully. In local newspapers and anecdotal histories from the mid-19th century, she was sometimes referred to as the Giant Woman of Charleston, or the Avenging Mother. Journalists and historians debated the plausibility of her survival, her legendary strength, and the authenticity of the sighting. Each retelling contributed to the myth, but even skeptics had to concede that Josiah Crane's death, the coroner's report, and the testimonies of witnesses were undeniable. At its core, the legend had a historical foundation, however much embellishment it accrued. In examining the story, historians note the broader cultural significance of Sarah Drummond. She represents an intersection of maternal love, resistance to oppression, and the ways in which legends can emerge from real historical trauma. The physical evidence, the crushed skull, the pistol, the sale records of Jacob, anchors the story in reality. The subsequent legends, sightings, and letters amplify her impact, demonstrating how one extraordinary act can ripple across time, inspiring hope, fear, and imagination in equal measure. The mystery of her ultimate fate continues to fuel debate. The most rational explanation, based on evidence and historical context, suggests that she likely succumbed to her gunshot wound in the swamps near Marshbend. Infection, exposure and the challenges of evading pursuers in hostile terrain make survival improbable. Yet the persistent accounts from safe houses, letters and distant sightings complicate this conclusion. If she survived even briefly, the North's abolitionist networks might have facilitated her escape, allowing her to evade capture and continue her search for Jacob. If not, the stories still preserved a symbolic version of her presence, an embodiment of resistance, maternal devotion, and indomitable will. The story of Jacob also illuminates the broader consequences of Sarah's action. Raised by the Hafford family in Savannah, he lived a life shaped by both the trauma of separation and the legacy of his mother's courage. Jacob eventually became a carpenter, raised a family, and passed on fragments of memory about his mother to his children. Among these fragments were small artifacts, like the carved wooden horse by Marcus, which preserved a tangible connection to a family forcibly divided by slavery. By naming his daughter Sarah, Jacob ensured that his mother's legacy would endure within his lineage, bridging past suffering with future hope. In many ways, the legend of Sarah Drummond transcends its historical context. It has become a story about the human capacity for resilience and resistance. Her actions highlight the ways individuals can assert agency, even in circumstances of extreme oppression. She is remembered for her strength, her determination, and her unyielding will, but also for the moral complexity her story embodies. The legend forces reflection on justice, power, and the human cost of systemic oppression. By the 20th century, Sarah Drummond's tale had entered a broader cultural imagination. Folklorists, historians, and educators drew on her story to illustrate the realities of slavery and the extraordinary courage of those who resisted it. Her life became a cautionary tale, a source of inspiration, and a historical puzzle, all at once. In classrooms, local histories, and oral traditions, she stood as a figure who defied the limitations imposed upon her, leaving a legacy that inspired both admiration and reflection. Ultimately, the story of Sarah Drummond challenges us to consider the nature of historical memory. Physical evidence, such as Josiah Crane's coroner report and the sale records of Jacob, provides a foundation for understanding events. Yet it is the stories told across generations, the songs, the diaries, the whispered accounts that give the narrative depth and resonance. Sarah's legend illustrates how personal acts of resistance can resonate far beyond their immediate context, shaping cultural memory and providing hope for those who hear them. The final truth of Sarah Drummond may remain forever elusive. Did she survive in the northern state? Did she continue searching for Jacob? Did she spend her final years in anonymity, quietly observing a world from which she had been denied justice? Or did she perish in the swamps, her body claimed by the wilderness, leaving only stories and memory to preserve her existence? We may never know. Yet her story remains a testament to human courage, a symbol of maternal devotion, and an enduring emblem of resistance against oppression. For modern readers, the tale of Sarah Drummond resonates because it confronts fundamental questions about power, justice, and the human spirit. Her legend challenges us to remember the lives and experiences of those enslaved, to recognize the extraordinary actions they sometimes took, and to honor the resilience that persisted, even in the darkest circumstance. Whether real, partially imagined, or mythologized, Sarah Drummond endures as a figure whose story continues to inspire, unsettle, and provoke reflection. Sarah Drummond's story, from the events of August 14, 1827, through the decades of rumor, legend, and regional memory, represents more than a single act of vengeance or a mysterious disappearance. It embodies the complex interplay between historical fact and cultural memory, the power of personal agency under oppression, and the ways in which stories can sustain hope, resistance, and identity across generations. The swampy landscapes of South Carolina, the forests of Georgia, and the safe houses of the Underground Railroad all serve as the backdrop for a legend that is both grounded in historical reality and transcendent in symbolic significance. Even today, scholars, historians, and storytellers grapple with the dual nature of Sarah Drummond, a historical woman of extraordinary courage, and a larger-than-life figure whose legend informs our understanding of resistance, motherhood, and the human spirit. Her story reminds us that acts of courage, no matter how isolated in time, can echo across generations, inspiring hope, fear, and admiration in ways that transcend the immediate circumstances of their occurrence. And so, while the swamps and forests may have claimed her physical presence, the legacy of Sarah Drummond remains unyielding. Through oral history, family memory, folklore, and scholarly research, her story endures a testament to resistance, to love, and to the indomitable human spirit. Even as decades passed, and the United States wrestled with the consequences of slavery, civil war, and Reconstruction, the story of Sarah Drummond persisted in memory, conversation, and folklore. Among former enslaved people, her tale continued to be told, not merely as entertainment, but as a moral and inspirational lesson. Even the most oppressed could find a way to resist, even when resistance seemed impossible. Her legend became part of the moral landscape of the South, a story whispered quietly in kitchens, fields, and safe houses, where the past's traumas and acts of courage were preserved orally. In literary and historical scholarship, Sarah Drummond's story has been cited as emblematic of broader truths about slavery and resistance. Scholars emphasize that her physical strength was inseparable from her social and psychological resilience. To survive the relentless exploitation, abuse, and systemic violence of Marshbend, and to take decisive action when her child was taken from her, required not only physical power, but extraordinary mental and emotional fortitude. This combination of attributes made her a symbol of defiance and empowerment, embodying the tension between survival and moral action under extreme oppression. The legend of Sarah Drummond also raises profound questions about the nature of history and memory. Events are recorded, documents are preserved, and testimonies are collected, but the human imagination transforms those facts into stories, legends, and myths. Sarah's life and disappearance are a case study in this process. We have verifiable records: the sale of Jacob, Josiah Crane's coroner report, the testimony of Ruth and other witnesses, and the letter received in Colombia. Yet for every verifiable fact, there are countless unverified but persistent accounts, from northern safe houses to southern swamps, that shape how communities remember her. The line between history and folklore becomes porous, and it is precisely this interplay that sustains her legend across centuries. One particularly striking aspect of Sarah's story is its adaptability. In the South, she was remembered sometimes as a cautionary tale of violence, a spectral avenger, or a figure whose mere presence threatened the social order. In northern abolitionist circles, she became a symbol of righteous resistance and maternal heroism, embodying the courage and moral authority to fight back against injustice. Among enslaved and formerly enslaved people, she represented hope, defiance, and the possibility of liberation. Across all these interpretations, the figure of Sarah Drummond evolved into something larger than a single individual. She became a vessel through which different communities could process, remember, and interpret the horrors and resistances of slavery. In the 20th century, historians attempting to reconcile legend with fact faced significant challenges. While some sightings, such as the 1889 Philadelphia account recorded by Dr. Robert Hayes, could never be fully verified, they suggested that oral traditions preserved some trace of truth. Letters, diaries, and recollections from abolitionists, formerly enslaved people, and even plantation owners painted a picture of a woman whose size, intelligence, and courage left a lasting impression on all who encountered her. These sources reinforced the reality that while Sarah may have disappeared physically, her actions and their consequences left indelible marks on the social and cultural landscape of the American South. Modern reinterpretations of Sarah Drummond's story have expanded beyond historical documentation into literature, art, and even popular culture. She appears in novels, plays, and historical essays as a figure embodying resistance, maternal devotion, and the moral complexity of revenge. Artists and writers emphasize different aspects of her legend: her extraordinary physical presence, her singular act of defiance, or the enduring search for her son. In every representation, Sarah serves as a focal point for grappling with questions of justice, oppression, and the human capacity for resilience. In reflecting on Sarah Drummond's story, it is essential to consider her actions not simply as a sensational tale of violence or strength, but as a profoundly human response to systemic dehumanization. She endured relentless labor, physical abuse, and humiliation, and her child, her primary source of hope, love, and identity, was violently taken from her. The act of killing Josiah Crane, therefore, was not only an assertion of agency, but also a reclaiming of selfhood in the face of total erasure. The fact that she disappeared afterward, leaving no trace, underscores the impossibility of survival for someone in her position, and yet also the extraordinary courage it took to attempt it. Sarah's story is also inseparable from the landscape in which it unfolded. The swamps, forests, and waterways of South Carolina and Georgia played a critical role in both her escape and her legend. These environments were dangerous, oppressive and treacherous, yet they'd also offered concealment, protection, and the possibility of freedom. Her disappearance into the wilderness speaks to the intimate knowledge enslaved people often had of the land, a knowledge that allowed them to evade capture, survive in hostile terrain, and navigate routes toward potential freedom. The landscape itself becomes a character in the narrative, shaping the possibilities and limitations of resistance. The legacy of Sarah Drummond also extends into discussions of memory, commemoration, and historical justice. While her story is often framed in sensational terms, it invites reflection on the broader realities of slavery, the moral failures of society, and the ways individuals responded to systemic violence. Her courage, intelligence, and determination are worth remembering not only as a legend, but as a historical testament to human resilience. Educators, historians, and cultural commentators frequently cite her story to illustrate the moral and psychological dimensions of oppression and resistance, emphasizing that extraordinary acts of defiance often arise in response to extraordinary injustice. Even as the historical record remains incomplete, the enduring fascination with Sarah Drummond underscores the human desire for justice, recognition, and remembrance. We are drawn to her story because it combines the extraordinary and the relatable, a mother, a human being, forced to make impossible choices under impossible conditions, who responded with courage, ingenuity, and ferocity. Her disappearance, whether through death or continued survival in secrecy, leaves a space for imagination, reflection, and moral consideration. It challenges us to think about the consequences of oppression, the nature of resistance, and the forms that justice can take when official systems fail. In the final analysis, Sarah Drummond is more than a historical figure. She is a symbol. She embodies the tension between survival and resistance, the moral complexity of revenge, and the enduring human desire to protect loved ones at all costs. Her story persists because it speaks to universal themes: courage in the face of impossible odds, the struggle for autonomy, and the consequences of systemic injustice. Whether she lived to see freedom in the North, succumbed in the swamps, or became a guiding spirit for others seeking liberation, her legend continues to resonate because it reminds us of the power of the human spirit, even under the most dehumanizing circumstance. Today, scholars and storytellers alike continue to debate the precise facts of Sarah Drummond's life and disappearance, but the core truths are undeniable. She existed, she resisted, she acted with extraordinary strength and determination, and she left a permanent mark on history and culture. The story of her son Jacob, who survived to live a full life, offers a poignant counterpoint, illustrating the long-term consequences of family separation under slavery and the enduring importance of maternal love, memory, and legacy. The mystery of Sarah Drummond endures, not because of the sensational elements alone, but because it encapsulates a profound human story. It is a story of courage, love, vengeance, and the struggle for autonomy in a world designed to deny it. It is a story that continues to inspire reflection, debate, and creative reinterpretation. And it is a story that challenges us, as readers and as a society, to confront the realities of the past, to honor acts of defiance, and to consider how memory, legend, and history intersect in ways that shape our understanding of both individuals and community. Sarah Drummond's life, her actions, and the legend that followed her into the decades after her disappearance serve as a testament to the human capacity for resilience, the moral complexities of resistance, and the enduring power of a story to transcend time, geography, and circumstance. The swamps of South Carolina, the forests of Georgia, the safe houses of Pennsylvania, and the recollections of those who lived after her all testify to her impact. She may have vanished physically, but her legacy, like the echoes of her footsteps through the wilderness, remains indelible. And so the story of Sarah Drummond ends as it began, with questions that cannot fully be answered, with mysteries that persist, and with a legacy that continues to inspire. The giant woman of Charleston, who took back her child, challenged a brutal system, and disappeared into the wilderness, remains a symbol of courage, resistance, and the enduring human spirit. Whether history remembers her as a tragic figure, a hero, or both, her story continues to captivate, haunt, and teach, reminding us that even in the darkest times, the human will can reach beyond the boundaries imposed upon it, leaving a mark that echoes across centuries. Even generations after Sarah Drummond vanished, her story continued to ripple through society, shaping how people thought about power, justice, and resistance. Among enslaved and freed Black communities in the South, her legend became more than a tale. It became a form of collective memory. Stories about her courage, strength, and relentless search for her son were shared not only to remember her, but to teach lessons about survival, resilience, and hope. Mothers would whisper the story to their children, warning them of cruelty, but also inspiring them with the idea that oppression could be resisted, that the human spirit could endure and fight back. White communities, especially plantation owners, told Sarah's story differently. To them, she was a cautionary tale, a terrifying reminder of what could happen if enslaved people were pushed too far. They spoke of her extraordinary size and strength in hushed tones, exaggerating her physical presence, until she became almost supernatural in reputation. Some even claimed she had gone mad in the swamps, or become a specter haunting the forests. These narratives, rooted in fear, served as a tool to enforce obedience, a way to rationalize increased control over enslaved people, while reinforcing the idea that the system itself must never be challenged. Meanwhile, abolitionists in the North reimagined Sarah as a heroic figure, a mother and a warrior fighting against the injustice of slavery. Her story appeared in letters, diaries, and newspaper accounts, often with embellishments that emphasized her intelligence, bravery, and moral courage. She became a symbol of righteous vengeance, an embodiment of the moral imperative to resist oppression. These accounts highlighted a key tension. The same act could be interpreted as monstrous or heroic, depending on who was telling the story. Sarah Drummond's life and actions thus became a mirror reflecting the biases, hopes, and fears of those who remembered her. Her legend also influenced literature, folklore, and music. Songs in slave quarters encoded her story in metaphor and allegory, recounting a woman who could move unseen, strike decisively, and disappear into the wilderness. Folk tales portrayed her as an avenging spirit, protecting runaways and punishing cruel masters, and these stories persisted well into the late 19th and early 20th. In the Northern imagination, she was sometimes portrayed as a guiding figure for those escaping the South, using her knowledge of the land to help others achieve freedom. Across these narratives, she evolved from a historical figure into a symbol of resistance, a story that transcended her personal life to reflect the struggles of countless others. The philosophical significance of Sarah's actions cannot be overlooked. At its core, her story challenges fundamental questions about justice, morality, and human agency under extreme oppression. She was denied basic rights, treated as property, and forced to endure unimaginable suffering. When her child was taken from her, she exercised what power she had in the only way left, through direct action against her oppressor. From a moral perspective, her story invites reflection on the ethics of resistance, the limits of endurance, and the ways that human dignity can assert itself even when the law and society deny it. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What would anyone do in her position? How do acts of resistance blur the line between justice and vengeance? And how should history remember those who acted outside the law to reclaim their humanity? Even the landscape itself became inseparable from Sarah Drummond's story. The swamps and forests of South Carolina and Georgia, treacherous yet protective, became the stage for her final act and her disappearance. Her intimate knowledge of this terrain allowed her to evade capture and survive, at least temporarily, beyond the reach of those pursuing her. The wilderness, harsh and indifferent, was both an adversary and an ally, its dangers a test of her resourcefulness, its concealment a tool of freedom. In this sense, the geography of the South becomes a character in her legend, shaping what was possible and impossible, sustaining the mystery of her disappearance, and amplifying her mythic stature. In examining Sarah Drummond's story, historians and storytellers grapple with the tension between fact and legend. The documented events, Josiah Crane's murder, the testimonies of witnesses, the sale of Jacob, the coroner's report, provide a foundation of truth. Yet the hundreds of unverified accounts, letters, diary entries, and folklore reveal how her story evolved, taking on dimensions of myth. These narratives speak to the human need to process trauma, celebrate courage, and imagine justice in a world where official systems fail to protect the vulnerable. The gaps in the historical record, the untraceable footprints, and the disappearance into the wilderness allow the imagination to fill in the spaces, preserving Sarah Drummond as both history and legend. Her story also resonates because it confronts the reality of motherhood under slavery. Sarah's maternal bond with Jacob was a source of hope, strength, and identity. The violent separation from her child catalyzed her decisive act of resistance. This aspect of her story, maternal love, pushed to the breaking point, adds emotional and ethical weight to the narrative. It is a reminder that the cruelty of slavery extended beyond labor and property. It tore apart families and robbed individuals of the most fundamental connections, creating situations where acts of extreme desperation were both understandable and inevitable. Ultimately, Sarah Drummond's story endures because it embodies a timeless human truth. When oppressed beyond endurance, humans will find ways to reclaim agency, to assert dignity, and to fight for what is rightfully theirs. Whether she perished in the swamps, escaped to the north, or lived a quiet life under another name, her story continues to inspire, haunt, and provoke reflection. She is a symbol of the indomitable spirit, the intersection of maternal love and moral courage, and the enduring power of human resistance in the face of injustice. Even today, over a century and a half after she disappeared, the legend of Sarah Drummond offers lessons for those seeking justice, for those fighting oppression, and for anyone striving to remember the resilience of those who came before. It reminds us that history is not only what is documented in books and archives, but also what survives in memory, story, and collective imagination. Sarah Drummond's legacy, both real and imagined, remains a testament to courage, resistance, and the unbreakable will of the human spirit. As the decades passed, the figure of Sarah Drummond continued to exist in the spaces between history and legend, a reminder that truth can be stranger, darker, and more inspiring than fiction. Scholars, folklorists, and storytellers have long debated what actually happened to her after she vanished from Marshbend, but perhaps the question itself is part of her enduring power. What we can say with certainty is this: on the night of August 14, 1827, a woman denied freedom and humanity exercised the last terrible freedom she had left, reshaping the course of her own story and leaving an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. Her legend spread far beyond South Carolina. In the Low Country, whispers of a giant woman protecting runaways or punishing cruel masters persisted for generations. In northern abolitionist circles, Sarah became a symbol of righteous vengeance and unyielding courage. Stories of her extraordinary size, strength, and determination were shared alongside tales of Harriet Tubman and other freedom fighters, creating a lineage of resistance that would inspire countless others. Even the most skeptical historians could not entirely dismiss the repeated accounts of people who claimed to have seen her, aided by no more than her reputation and the shadows of the wilderness she inhabited. Sarah's story also reminds us of the complexity of memory and history. For some, she is a monster. For others, she is a heroine. She is simultaneously a mother, a rebel, a myth, and a cautionary tale. The multiplicity of her image reflects the multiplicity of human experience under slavery. Different communities, different perspectives, and different needs shaped how her story was told, preserved or exaggerated. Yet underneath all the interpretations, the core truth remains: she acted with extraordinary courage in a world designed to strip her of agency. The mystery of her disappearance invites reflection on the power of the landscape in shaping human history. The swamps and forests of the South, often depicted as inhospitable or dangerous, offered Sarah a final sanctuary. Their hidden paths, tangled waterways, and shadowed depths allowed her to escape the reach of those who sought to control her. In this, nature itself becomes a participant in the story, a silent witness to her final act of defiance. Her knowledge of the land, her ability to navigate it, and the seemingly impossible way she vanished, are as much a part of her legend as the events in the library at Marshbend. Her maternal devotion is another enduring thread. The search for Jacob, her child, underscores the emotional and moral dimensions of her story. Every account, every letter, and every tale of a woman seeking a child speaks to a universal truth: love, especially parental love, can drive humans to extraordinary. It was the loss of her son that precipitated her decisive act at Marshbend, and it is the quest for her child that fuels the legends of her survival. In this way, the story transcends historical boundaries to touch something timeless and deeply human. Ultimately, Sarah Drummond's story is a testament to resistance in its purest form. It challenges us to consider what it means to fight back when all systems are against you. It forces us to ask, what would any human being do when pushed beyond endurance? Her legacy lies not only in the act that made her infamous, but in the enduring inspiration she provides. Whether she died in the swamps, escaped to freedom, or lived under another name far to the north, she remains a symbol of courage, agency, and defiance. Today, historians continue to study her life, the events at Marshbend, and the ripple effects her actions had on communities and collective memory. Archaeologists examine plantation records, folklorists collect oral histories, legal scholars ponder the implications of her act of rebellion. Each new piece of evidence or interpretation deepens our understanding, yet none can completely unravel the mystery. That is the nature of legend. It is both anchored in reality and free to inhabit the imaginations of generations to come. Sarah Drummond's story teaches us about the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring impact of injustice, and the ways in which one individual's courage can resonate across time. Her tale reminds us that history is not merely a record of events, but a living narrative shaped by memory, interpretation, and belief. It is a narrative that endures because it speaks to universal truths: the need for freedom, the bond between parent and child, and the power of resistance against oppression. In the end, we may never know exactly what happened to Sarah Drummond after she disappeared from Marshbend. The swamps may have claimed her, or she may have walked unseen into a life of quiet survival. What remains undeniable, however, is the legacy she left behind. Her act of defiance, her strength, and her relentless pursuit of her child made her a figure whose story cannot be forgotten. She became more than a historical figure. She became a symbol of resistance, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit. And so Sarah Drummond lives on, not just in records or testimonies, but in every story of defiance, every whispered legend, and every heart inspired by her courage. She reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, individual acts of bravery can shine through, and that the fight for justice, dignity, and love is timeless. Her story, both tragic and empowering, endures as a beacon of resilience, illuminating the depths of human strength and the unyielding desire for freedom. Even today, nearly 2 centuries later, Sarah Drummond's story challenges the way we think about history, memory, and legend. She occupies a unique space where documented fact and oral storytelling meet, a liminal space where the extraordinary can exist alongside the plausible. Historians can reconstruct the events of August 14, 1827, from records, testimonies, and physical evidence, but no archive can capture the enormity of her presence, the intensity of her grief, or the resolve that drove her to an act so violent, yet so purposeful. The legend of Sarah Drummond also prompts reflection on the broader realities of slavery in the American South. Her story exposes the human cost of an institution built on cruelty, exploitation, and the denial of personhood. It reveals the extremes to which oppression can drive individuals and the lengths to which they will go to reclaim dignity and agency. In many ways, the narrative of Sarah Drummond is not just about one woman. It is a lens through which we can examine the lived experiences of countless enslaved people whose voices were never recorded. Cultural memory has preserved Sarah in ways that formal history often can't. Songs, oral traditions, and local tales all kept her story alive in the collective consciousness of communities affected by slavery. Among enslaved people, she was a symbol of empowerment, an embodiment of the idea that resistance, even against overwhelming odds, was possible. Among slaveholders, she was a figure of fear, a cautionary tale warning that cruelty has consequences. This duality illustrates how one act can reverberate through time in very different ways, depending on perspective. The unanswered questions surrounding her fate only add to her mystique. Did she succumb to her wound in the swamps, leaving nothing but whispers and half-remembered sightings behind? Or did she find sanctuary, adopting a new identity and continuing to seek her son in secret, guided by communities of free black people and abolitionists? The letters sent from Columbia, the stories from the Underground Railroad, and the dying woman in Philadelphia all suggest that something extraordinary may have occurred. And yet with each story the line between fact and legend blurs, inviting both skepticism and awe. Sarah's story also speaks to the universal themes of maternal love, justice, and the human will to survive. Her search for Jacob, her confrontation with Josiah Crane, and her mysterious disappearance are not merely historical events. They are a testament to the lengths a mother will go to protect and reclaim her child. Her courage transcends the particulars of time and place, resonating with anyone who has ever faced injustice or loss. Finally, the legacy of Sarah Drummond reminds us of the power of stories themselves. Legends endure because they capture something essential about the human experience: the struggle for freedom, the triumph of courage, and the haunting consequences of oppression. Her story is retold, not only because of the violence or the mystery, but because it speaks to a fundamental truth. Even in the darkest circumstances, individuals can assert their humanity in ways that inspire generations. The swamps and forests of the South may have hidden her, the historical record may have forgotten her, and yet Sarah Drummond lives on in memory and legend. She is a figure of resistance, a mother's determination, and a symbol of the indomitable human spirit. Whether she survived to see her son again, or whether she found peace in the wilderness, her story continues to captivate, educate, and inspire. It is a story that challenges us to reflect on history, to honor courage, and to remember that even the most oppressed among us can leave a mark that echoes for centuries. Sarah Drummond remains a testament to the truth that sometimes history is not just what happened, it is also what endures in memory, legend, and the human imagination. Over time, the story of Sarah Drummond grew beyond the confines of Marshbend and the low country of South Carolina. Stories traveled along riverways, carried in whispers from cabin to cabin, through secret gatherings, and later through letters and interviews collected by historians and journalists. She became more than a woman. She became a symbol, larger than life in both size and reputation, embodying the spirit of resistance that could not be broken by chains, oppression, or violence. Some accounts painted her as a spectral figure haunting the swamps and forests, appearing when least expected, a guardian for those fleeing bondage. Others portrayed her as a tireless searcher, moving quietly through towns and settlements, her extraordinary height and strength giving her an almost supernatural presence. Children in rural communities were told to behave or risk meeting the giant woman of Charleston, a story that was part warning, part folklore, ensuring that her name and her deeds would not be forgotten. Historians examining slave narratives, plantation records, and oral histories noticed a pattern. Wherever rumors of Sarah circulated, they were often tied to acts of courage, protection, or retribution. Some escaped enslaved people credited her with providing food, guidance, or intelligence that allowed them to evade capture. In this way, Sarah's legend intertwined with the history of the Underground Railroad, linking her not just to a singular act of defiance, but to a network of resistance spanning the South and reaching into the North. Yet there remained an undeniable tension between myth and reality. The logical, evidence-based perspective suggested that her gunshot wound, her pursuit by armed men, and the harshness of the wilderness would have made survival nearly impossible. Medical experts of her time understood the severity of such injuries without proper care, and the swamps of South Carolina were known for their unforgiving terrain, wild animals, and disease. If she survived, it would have required extraordinary resilience, resourcefulness, and the assistance of others who risked their lives to hide her. Even as decades passed, the story of Sarah Drummond inspired both fear and admiration. Among enslaved communities, she was a beacon of what could be achieved when one refused to be subjugated, a reminder that courage and cunning could defy even the most entrenched systems of power. Among white plantation owners, her legend became a cautionary tale, repeated in whispers, sermons, and letters. Never underestimate the resolve of those you oppress. Her tale forced them to confront a truth they preferred to ignore, that the human spirit cannot be completely enslaved, and that cruelty carries consequences. Artifacts of memory kept Sarah's story alive as well. Some descendants of the Hapford family reportedly kept letters and small carvings linked to her son Jacob, preserving fragments of history that tied back to Marshbend. Enslaved and free, Black communities preserved oral histories for generations, embedding her story into the cultural fabric. Songs, stories, and coded messages ensured that even if her physical presence was gone, her spirit endured. The story of Sarah Drummond ultimately reveals the limits of historical certainty. Documents, testimonies, and physical evidence allow us to reconstruct the events of that August night with remarkable detail, yet the full scope of her life and the exact nature of her disappearance remain elusive. What historians can say with certainty is that she existed, she acted with lethal determination, and her impact rippled far beyond that fateful night. But what she did after vanishing from Marshbend is left to interpretation, imagination, and the enduring power of legend. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. The stories we tell about resistance, courage, and defiance carry as much weight as the events themselves. Sarah Drummond's life and the life she might have led after escaping reminds us that history is not only about recording events, but about understanding the human capacity for survival, for justice, and for hope. Her tale invites us to grapple with the complex realities of slavery, the moral ambiguities of revenge and retribution, and the ways in which individual acts of courage can resonate across generations. Whether Sarah survived the swamps, found her son, and lived out her days in secret, or whether she perished shortly after her daring escape, the legend she left behind continues to shape the way we think about resistance, motherhood, and the human desire for freedom. Her story endures not because every detail is verifiable, but because it captures the imagination, inspires courage, and challenges us to remember the humanity of those who lived under unimaginable oppression. Sarah Drummond may have disappeared into the darkness of the wilderness, but she never disappeared from memory. She lives in the songs of the enslaved, in the whispered warnings of fearful plantation owners, in the letters and diaries of abolitionists, and in the ongoing quest of historians to reconstruct the past. In every telling she is larger than life, not just in stature, but in spirit, a reminder that one act of resistance can echo for centuries. The story of Sarah Drummond concludes, not with a neatly tied ending, but with the lingering questions and echoes of a life lived on the edge of history and legend. What is undeniable is the night of August 14, 1827, when a woman pushed beyond endurance by a system designed to dehumanize her, seized a moment to reclaim her agency. Josiah Crane, a man who had wielded power over her and her child, met a violent end that night, his death a stark testament to what happens when oppression meets unbreakable will. Beyond that night, the historical record fades. Sarah's trail disappears into the swamps, rivers, and forests of the South Carolina Low Country, leaving only fragments: the blood trail that ended at the swamp's edge, the letter received in Columbia, and the stories carried by those who claimed encounters with a giant woman searching tirelessly for her son. These fragments straddle the line between reality and myth, and they highlight a truth often overlooked in historical narratives: the most extraordinary human experiences are not always neatly documented, yet their impact resonates for generations. Jacob, the son taken from her, lived a life shaped by the echoes of his mother's courage. Raised in Savannah by the Hafford family, he grew into adulthood, married and built a life of his own. He carried physical reminders of his parents, like the small wooden horse carved by Marcus, and he preserved Sarah's story, ensuring that the legacy of resistance, survival, and maternal devotion endured. Even as he adapted to a world shaped by emancipation and reconstruction, he remained a living link to the extraordinary events at Marshbend, a reminder that history is not only written in documents but carried in memory, family, and community. The legend of Sarah Drummond also illuminates the cultural imagination of her time and beyond. Among enslaved and free Black communities, she became a symbol of resistance and hope. Among white communities, she became a cautionary tale, a source of fear and moral anxiety. These contrasting perceptions illustrate how one life, one act of defiance, can ripple across social, racial, and cultural boundaries. Her story reminds us that history is often as much about perception and narrative as it is about events, that the ways people choose to remember or to fear can shape collective memory. There is beauty in the ambiguity of her fate. Perhaps she succumbed to her injuries in the swamps, becoming part of the wilderness that had long been both sanctuary and trap. Perhaps she survived, aided by those who risked everything to help fugitive enslaved people, ultimately finding anonymity and freedom far from the plantations she had known. Either way, Sarah Drummond's life resonates as a narrative of defiance, maternal devotion, and unyielding human will. Her story has endured for nearly 2 centuries because it captures something fundamental: the lengths a person will go to reclaim their dignity, to fight for their child, and to resist oppression at any cost. Historians, folklorists, and storytellers continue to debate the line between myth and reality, but that debate itself is a testament to her enduring power. The fascination with Sarah Drummond is not merely about her size, her strength, or the violent act that propelled her into legend. It is about the moral and emotional weight of her story, the humanity she asserted in a world that sought to deny it, the love she carried for her son, and the courage she displayed in the face of impossible odds. In the end, Sarah Drummond's story challenges us to confront difficult truths about history. It reminds us that the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, can transcend fear, pain, and subjugation. It asks us to consider what it means to fight for justice when no legal system will protect you, to act when the cost is total, and to leave a legacy that defies erasure. Sarah may never be found, and her fate may never be confirmed, but in every retelling she lived, in every story passed down through generations, in every whispered account of the giant woman of Charleston, in every song and diary entry that remembers her courage, Sarah Drummond remains present. She is proof that history is not only what is recorded, but also what endures in memory, imagination, and legend. The swamps of South Carolina, the forests of Georgia, the hidden paths of the Underground Railroad, and even the quiet streets of Pennsylvania, where she may have lived, These places are all touched by her story, and though the facts of her later life may be uncertain, the truth of her act and the reality of her existence are indisputable. Sarah Drummond was real. She acted, she resisted, she became a symbol of the human capacity to endure, to fight and to defend. Her story is a reminder that courage can take many forms, that resistance can be as quiet as a step into darkness, or as loud as a single act that echoes through history. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that even in the darkest periods of human history, there are those who rise above oppression, whose deeds ripple across generations, and whose memory cannot be extinguished. Sarah Drummond, the giant woman of Charleston, is one such figure. She lives on, not just in legend, but in the undeniable mark she left on history, and in the enduring testament of a mother's love that refused to be broken.